There we go. Fabulous. I've been here in Naperville for about 5.5 months now, so I'm relatively new to the Chicagoland area, and am really excited to be part of such a rich public library environment and library environment in general that's served by Rails. Previously, I was the deputy director at the Brown County Library in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And I'll show you, here's the beautiful Central Library in downtown Green Bay. If you're not aware, this style of architecture is known as brutalism. What I'm going to talk about today is some of what we learned about performance management in general, and how to implement kind of a new process for doing performance evaluation. Before I go into how that all came to be, I do just want to give you a little background information about Brown County Library. It's a county library system that serves about 250,000 people from a central library, 8 branches, and a bookmobile. And they do that with about 87 full-time equivalent employees. They're really, really leanly staffed. And up until this happened in July of 2011, when collective bargaining totally changed in Wisconsin. About 92% of our employees were covered by a union contract. So that was essentially our governor pulling the rug out from underneath our employees. At about the same time, the Brown County Library was going through a transition where the county was finally kind of recognizing the library board's authority over library employees. So if we hadn't taken any action after Act 10 came around, we would have had to just kind of take whatever personnel policies came to us from the county. And those often didn't work for us very well. So one of the things that we decided to do at Brown County was to address all of our personnel policies and procedures as an organization, and basically do them from scratch, which was really exciting. I guess that tells you a lot about me and being a nerd and a glutton for punishment. But it meant that we really got to be deliberate about how we addressed personnel stuff. One of the key things that we did was assemble what we called our Work Rules Committee. That was made up from staff throughout the organization from all different levels and backgrounds, longevity, different library locations. Each of those representatives to the Work Rules Committee, which had about 13 people, was chosen in some way or another by the staff of the department or branch that they represented. I'm just going to throw up the ground rules that the committee came up with right at the beginning of our work. It just kind of gives you an idea of what was important to the members of the committee. And it also tells you a little bit about what the culture at Brown County Library was like before this process started. I wouldn't say it was exactly antagonistic between administration and staff, but there wasn't a whole lot of trust, and I think that staff were really kind of nervous about how this process was going to move forward. We made a big, huge, scary list of all of the things we knew that our personnel policies were going to have to cover, and we got through most of them by the time we kind of narrowed down to these two. Our job descriptions and classifications, as well as performance appraisals. Now, previously, none of our employees had really had a performance review, kind of ever. We had 3- and 5-month probationary reviews, but after passing probation, a lot of our employees never had any kind of performance evaluation at all. So when I first got to Brown County, that just blew my mind. I was like, what do you mean nobody's had a performance review? Looking at it from the staff's perspective, though, if you've been at the library for 15 or 20 or 30 years throughout your entire career, and you just lost the protection of your collective bargaining unit, and now all of a sudden we're going to evaluate you, that's kind of a big, scary deal. So the way that we handled it had to be really careful and deliberate. Unfortunately, there are a lot of negative stereotypes about performance evaluation, and you may recognize some of these. Dilbert, of course, Toby Flenderson from The Office, he's like the proto-HR guy. These stereotypes obviously are pretty exaggerated, but they come out of some truth, and that is that performance appraisal can be really bad, like just done really badly. I will say the form itself is frequently the subject of a lot of dissatisfaction, usually because they try to be sort of one size fits all. These are kind of a random assortment that I just pulled off of Google. And I don't know, I hope that they don't look familiar to any of you. I'm sure that none of them are really library related. I think I made sure of that. One of the problems with many performance evaluation forms, however, is that they really try to cover everything, every job in an organization, which means that they end up being not relevant in some way to just about every job in the organization. So when you get to the level of being a manager or supervisor, presumably you've gotten to the point where attendance and punctuality are not an issue for you anymore. And so having that be as important as job knowledge on a performance evaluation form just doesn't make any sense at all. At a previous library, I actually would start off the performance evaluation process by saying, yeah, so this form is dumb, but it's what I have to use, so we're going to gloss over these categories, and then we're going to spend a lot of time talking, and I'm going to document that in a narrative in the comments instead of paying a lot of attention to these kind of arbitrary categories. I just want to call your attention to the center one. There's that rating factors section up at the top with a 7-point scale that, like, 4 through 7 are, I don't, like, how can you get that granular about it? And again, it seems very, very arbitrary. In a lot of organizations, unfortunately, the only time employees ever get feedback comes with the performance evaluation, which is often an annual process. And unfortunately, I think the rest of the time, sometimes because there isn't that priority given to feedback as part of the process, supervisors can let it fall to the back burner and not make it a regular part of their job when working with employees. So we know that there's some bad stuff out there that we knew we wanted to stay away from. So with all that in mind, we started to do some research into what are best practices in performance management. And since we got to build our process from scratch, we wanted to make sure that we did it right off the bat. So the first thing we started with was, why do performance evaluation at all? We did some brainstorming with our work rules committee and came up with a list of some of the reasons that performance appraisals happen. And in part, these are all pretty accurate, but no one of them is the reason that we do performance appraisals. They may kind of come out, these things may come out of that process. But really, the main thing about performance appraisals is ultimately to improve the performance of the organization. So in the library world, improving our performance means that we're making sure that we're delivering the highest quality library service that we possibly can for our customers or patrons. So the performance of everyone who works for the library has to come back to meeting the needs of our customers or patrons. That's our purpose, and that's what the purpose of performance appraisals really ought to be. In the human resources field, there's been a shift away from kind of the annual rating-based form and more toward a process that's a little more holistic, a model that's referred to as performance management. So from our research, there were kind of 4 major goals that came out of it. First, to align employee performance to organizational objectives. In other words, making sure that what you're doing as an individual is meeting the needs of the library as a whole. Communicating performance expectations to employees for shared understanding. So making sure that you and your supervisor understand your job in the same way and that you both understand the expectations for performance. recognizing and acknowledging good performance. Obviously, there's a ton of reasons that's important, not least of which being that positive feedback is just about the most effective mechanism there is for changing behavior. And then identifying areas where employee development would improve performance, not just of the employee, but making the performance of the organization as a whole better. So making you better by making the library better. In the performance management model, there's a lot more going on than just filling out a form. If you're going to use a form, which most people do because there needs to be some record of having performed that evaluation, you want to make sure that you get it right, but it really should be a small part of the process. It's the concrete thing that results from a performance evaluation, so it's easy to get hung up on it and really focus on it, but it shouldn't be the focus of the process, and we wanted to make sure that was the case for us. We learned a lot about do's and don'ts. One of the things we kind of heard over and over again, and that we knew that we wanted to do was to exclude any kind of a rating from our performance evaluation. Ratings are inherently problematic. They're kind of arbitrary, and there's inherent bias in any kind of rating system. And that's because supervisors are human beings. They're not robots, and it's a subjective thing. So as much as you try, it's really almost impossible to come up with a completely consistent approach to rating employees, both within the same job description and across an organization. The one-size-fits-all thing kind of raises its ugly head again here, where the rating system, so if you're going to use a rating system, you have to figure out what you're rating, and the things that apply to one job really may not apply to another job at all. Ratings also imply that employees have direct control over issues that may impact their performance, but that really lie outside of their control. They may be kind of system things about how stuff works, or process things, or they don't have the resources they need. And in the implication in that kind of rating system is that the employee can change things in those areas, which really doesn't do the employee any favors when it isn't something that they can change. I will say here at Naperville Public Library, the areas that we currently cover in our performance evaluation are tied to the library's values, which I actually really like a lot. It's less about the specific kind of categories that you see here on the screen and more about how we approach our job and what's important to us as a library, which I think is a much better approach. The other thing about ratings is that as human beings, we focus on grades and numbers, especially the outliers. So if you get this performance evaluation, the thing you're going to look at is that right there. So why did I get a 3? Why didn't I get a 4 on that one? I find stuff to do all the time. I'm self-motivated. What's the problem? So it doesn't matter what's in the comments at the end of this performance review. It doesn't matter that my adaptability is on the top of the chart. The thing I'm going to focus on is that, and that's really kind of counterproductive. So this kind of a system all but guarantees that employees aren't going to see or hear the things that are important about improving performance for them and for the organization. So what we decided to really focus on a lot is ongoing coaching and feedback. As I mentioned, the once-a-year performance review as the sole feedback mechanism for employees doesn't work very well, and I'm sure that that's not something that any of us do on a regular basis. I think we're a little smarter than that. But there's all kinds of research that backs up the fact that feedback is really important, whether it's positive or negative feedback. One of my favorite experiments on this subject is from Dan Ariely. This is from his book, The Upside of Irrationality. He constructed this experiment to get college students to stick to performing a tedious task, and then measured how much their success varied depending on how the experimenter responded every time they turned in their work. So they had these worksheets, and they had to circle repeated letters, and they were given like a small amount of money, like 50 cents for the first sheet and then 45 for the second, all the way down to zero. So there was a diminishing incentive to continue to perform this task. The acknowledged condition was when the experimenter would accept the completed form from the student. They'd look it over, kind of nod, put it on the pile, and then offer them another worksheet. And the students in that condition completed an average of around 9 worksheets, with 47% of them completing 10 or more. At the other end of the spectrum, the experimenter just shredded their sheets. They took it, didn't look at it, put it right in the shredder, destroyed before their very eyes. Not surprisingly, the motivation to continue with that dropped off considerably. But what I find most fascinating about this experiment is that ignoring the student's work, taking the piece of paper, not looking at it, putting it on the pile, offering them a new one, was almost as bad as actively destroying the student's work. So the message in this study is that, we know intuitively that providing acknowledgement of people's work leads to better performance, but ignoring effort, failing to acknowledge it, not offering any feedback at all, is almost as bad as actively trashing it. So, that made a big impact on us. Another thing that came up a lot was about the regularity that feedback really needs to take. And waiting until you get to the point where you use your form or process doesn't help an employee address any issues that might come up over the course of the year. One of the things that my first boss told me, and what I've told every person I've ever supervised since then, is that if I'm doing my job well, then there should be no surprises when we sit down to talk about performance. I should have been giving you feedback on an ongoing basis all along, so if there are any issues with your performance, you already know about them before you set foot in my office for that performance review. There are some mistakes in giving feedback that are pretty common. One of them is having the feedback all go one direction. So two-way feedback is kind of an important piece of the puzzle. It's easy for the employee to just expect to get that feedback from the supervisor and just taking it and walking away with it, instead of it being a conversation where that talk is part of the process of understanding how to improve performance. Another related mistake is making it be all the boss's job. We're adults, and it's a little bit condescending for me to say, I'm going to tell you how you're doing, and you just need to wait until I come and tell you that. And the employee really also has to take some responsibility for seeking feedback and for letting the supervisor know if they're not getting the feedback they need about their performance. There's also the old feedback sandwich, which is that thing where you say, so Mary, you always do such a good job with customers. I really appreciate that about you. But last night I noticed you did this thing wrong with the cash register, and I need you to never do that again. And also keep up the work on keeping your desk clean. You're doing a great job. It's awesome. So this is something that comes really natural to us as human beings, because it's hard to just say straight to somebody's face, I have a problem with what you're doing. But by sandwiching that negative feedback between positive feedback, it actually conditions people to expect that after you give them some positive feedback, they're going to hear something bad about what they're doing. You start to expect the negative to come after the positive, which completely undermines the ability to give positive feedback in a way that doesn't make the employee just tune out, and that doesn't do anybody any good. So before we got started with our new process, we knew we needed to do some work on feedback. So we did training for all of our employees, supervisors, and frontline line staff about feedback. That this is kind of just an overview of some of the things that we talked about with employees about feedback. We used a model that I really like a lot, Brat and Brett, just as a way to think about how that conversation can go. There are other models out there. This is kind of the one that we settled on. But it helps structure a conversation, especially in an environment where giving and receiving feedback isn't something that people have a lot of practice with. Another thing that we learned about performance evaluation is that it really needs to focus on the things that have an impact on performance. And it's not about finding what's wrong with people, but finding ways where improving performance really is going to improve the service we provide to our customers. One of the things that's really common in traditional performance reviews is that the review or the results of that review form the basis for making decisions about promotion or pay increases, or they might play a role if layoffs have to happen. And the conventional wisdom is that that's something that you really should try to keep separate, that performance evaluation is really about improvement, and stuff about discipline or layoffs or promotion should be a separate process. Now, that isn't to say that you can't talk about things that might otherwise be part of a discussion about a pay increase or promotion, or that you aren't going to talk about things that might be subject to disciplinary action. But the performance management process isn't the place for that decision-making or documentation to take place. Any performance issues really need to be documented separately, and any action taken to provide discipline for those problems should be a separate process from performance evaluation. And then finally, the other thing that we learned about best practices in performance management is that it should be as collaborative as possible, especially when it comes to setting goals for performance improvement. Obviously, there are going to be things where it's really just the nature of the work that needs to get done, and there isn't a lot of choice in the matter for the employee. So if I'm a shelver and I don't like shelf reading, I really don't have a lot of choice in the matter. It's an important part of what we do to make sure that people can find what they're looking for. If I'm constantly dodging shelf reading, my supervisor really probably has to talk to me about it. With that said, however, when it comes to identifying ways to improve performance, I am absolutely entitled to have some say in that discussion. And as a result, the likelihood that I'll follow through on that really is going to dramatically improve the likelihood that that performance is going to improve as well. So all of that is what we learned about how to do it right. So what did our process end up looking like? Here's what we did. The very first thing is we took a look at our job descriptions. Here's a job description for a job that used to be called clerk. We had 45 people in that job, and of the people who were in that job, there were actually 3 different roles that people played, but they were all working under the same job description, which meant that there was no official document that said, here's what we expect of you in this particular job as it relates to your duties. We really thought that if we were going to create a new process, we wanted to have job descriptions that were accurate and reliable, so that people could really look to them for information about the job that they were hired to do. So we went through all of our job descriptions and gave them a major overhaul, including realigning some positions and job duties. So the job descriptions took on kind of a new and consistent format. There's a section about the essential duties for the job. They had been just that big random list of things that really doesn't give you any information about what's most important. And we took that and kind of organized it under general categories and gave people an idea of how much time or priority each of those tasks might be given. There is a range. Depending on the location, that was going to be different, but there's a hierarchy of importance in those duties. We went through all of the knowledge, skills, and abilities sections on every job description. We reevaluated some of them, made sure that they were consistent from one job to another. So if being flexible in scheduling was important, as it is here in number 12, that same language was used in every job description for the library. And then we created a completely new section in our job descriptions that we've called expectations. So the way we looked at it is that the duties are kind of the what of the job. This is what you're expected to do. The expectations are more the how of your job. So this is the way we want you to perform this work. These are the things that we're going to be looking for and holding you to as you perform the duties of your job. Some of them are really general. The first section, all library employees are expected to follow policies and procedures, for instance, and that actually applies to everybody who works at the library. Others are really driven by metrics that are specific to a particular job. So in this one, library service assistants are expected to meet what we had set as the basic shelving benchmark for staff. Reshelving at an average rate of speed of at least 75 items per hour and an average accuracy rate of 97%. It's a very attainable target. We didn't want to set anybody up for failure, not ever having had this kind of target to work for. But it also gives us a way to be able to say definitively, you know, your shelving rate isn't meeting the target that we have. So what can we do to help you meet that expectation? So once everyone had a complete and updated job description, we really used that as the basis for our performance management model. The way that we structure it, there are 3 phases in that model. The first one is performance and development planning. This includes clarifying responsibilities and expectations so that you as an employee and your supervisor both understand what the job is. And it also sets goals for performance and training for whatever period that review is going to cover. The planning phase also includes defining what success looks like so that you and your supervisor both know how to tell if you got there, as well as identifying potential obstacles. We wanted people to think ahead of time about things that might keep them from reaching a particular goal. Some might be completely outside their control. I might have a great goal for my performance, but if I just plain run out of time because we're short-staffed, that's going to keep me from meeting it. We wanted people to think of what those obstacles might be ahead of time, and as a result, how they might overcome those obstacles. The next piece of the model is coaching. So this is that steady stream of feedback about performance. A big part of this phase comes from the supervisor, but the employee is also responsible for feedback, both making sure that your supervisor is giving you the feedback you need to do the job, as well as giving the supervisor feedback about his or her own performance as a boss. It's the two-way street there. And then the third phase is the actual formal performance review of any goals that were set at the beginning of that review period. We don't want it to be a report card. It's really just a recap of what's happened with the goals that you set and of the coaching and feedback that's been happening over the course of that period of time. So each period starts with the plan that the employee and the supervisor create, followed by the ongoing coaching and feedback to let you know how you're doing, and then the review at the end of that period of time to see how well those goals have been met. And then once you're done looking back at the last review period, you turn around and look forward for the next period of time. So the way it's a cycle that just kind of keeps running around and around. The way that this is visually constructed, though, implies that each one of these pieces has equal importance or should take the same amount of time, and we didn't think that really represented the process we wanted to put in place. So we revised it to look like this. The planning part is still substantial, but the coaching and feedback part is really big. Since that's the most effective way for performance management to work, and it's such a big change in how we were used to working, we wanted to really visually emphasize that coaching is the biggest portion of our performance management model. My experience as a supervisor is that investing the time in that coaching really pays off for both of us. It keeps things clear in both directions, but it's very time-consuming and was something completely new for both our staff and our employees. We had old habits that we were trying to overcome, and we're creating new habits. So this was going to be a work in progress that was going to take some time. We did a lot of communication with staff in a lot of different venues and formats. So visits to staff meetings, employee newsletters. I put together a screencast that really was just me talking over a PowerPoint for people who were more visually oriented or orally oriented to kind of get a sense of what this model was going to look like. We wanted to make sure that people heard about this from lots of different directions so that there weren't any surprises about the process once we get started. So once we had this model in place, then we needed to actually construct the forms. So the first thing that we really focused on was the initial performance planning process. And I can't emphasize enough how important it was for us to be really sensitive to staff and how they were feeling about this process. Again, keeping in mind the events of July 2011 and the fact that this is completely new territory for them and that they're really scared of what this is going to mean. So the Work Rules Committee and their broad representation from among all of our staff was really helpful. They helped us to kind of gauge what the reaction might be across staff and address that ahead of time. So we started with just a worksheet that we gave to employees before their first performance plan. And one of the things we did was put a big fat note at the top of it that said, "This is not an official thing. It's not going to go in your file. This is really just a way to help you think about this process and also to remind people that we aren't looking for things that are wrong with you. This is ways, we want to find ways to make the library better and stronger by helping you improve your performance." So we asked supervisors and employees to complete these worksheets separately and then to trade a couple days ahead of time, both directions. So the supervisor has a version of this form as well, so that the employee also has some time to kind of process what the supervisor has to say and not feel quite so put on the spot. Did some more disclaimer action. We asked people to look at the essential and secondary duties of their job description to say, which things that they felt like they did well, as well as things where they need some additional practice training or resources. Same thing with knowledge, skills, and abilities. Which essentially gets at strengths. And that can be a really hard question to answer if you're not really practiced in self-examination or if you're not comfortable owning the things that you're good at. I mean, we have a lot of women who are middle-aged or older who, for whatever reason, culturally often aren't comfortable saying, this is something I'm good at, to identify that strength, which is why we added that thing about, what areas do your coworkers come to you first when they need help as a different way to think about it. We also asked them to look at the expectations section and to identify obstacles where they don't have enough training or resources or whatever. And then after swapping the forms, the supervisor and employee sit down and have a meeting, and they talk through them. Feedback that we got was that a lot of employees were and supervisors were really surprised by how closely each one identified the employee's strengths or things that they did well, which was really good to hear. It meant that our supervisors really had a good handle on what was going on with their employees. Then, as part of that meeting, they also completed this form. This is the part that ends up in the employee's file, and it got sent to the Brown County HR department. The library is a department of county government, and they needed to have something in the file to satisfy their performance appraisal requirement. So we sent it to them basically to say, yes, we had a conversation about performance, a couple of yes-no questions to really reinforce the importance of expectations and that shared understanding. We wanted to then have the employee and the supervisor set one or two objectives for each area of their performance plan. The first section was about work objectives. So again, this is going back to the what of the job. So what are you going to accomplish? What are the things on your to-do list for this next period of time? The expectations section, the performance plan, that gets at the how of the job. So how are you going to improve the manner in which you complete the tasks that are part of your job, or how well are you going to meet those expectations? And then finally, we had some training objectives. They could be things that addressed specific items from the work or performance plan, or they could be completely different areas for growth or development, which was kind of a nice thing. So it really just could be 3 to 6 objectives for the next period of time. We started with a 6-month time frame. Since we didn't have any practice as an organization doing this kind of appraisal. After doing this a couple times, we've extended that out to a year, but having that shorter time frame, I think, was really helpful. And then finally, the supervisor and the employee get to add comments, and the employee actually gets to add comments and then send it to library administration directly, so they get the last say. Again, there weren't any disagreements that we were trying to address between the supervisor and the employee, but we wanted to let employees feel like we weren't pulling anything over on them. We wanted to give them complete transparency in this process. So to give them the last word was really something we thought was important. So then over the 6-month period of time of this performance plan, the ongoing coaching and feedback, lots and lots and lots. And then it comes time to do the review, which really is just a recap of how things went over the last 6 months. So it looks kind of similar to the performance plan when we get a little further into it. There are questions at the top just to prompt to make sure that there's room to have these pieces of the conversation. There's a section about expectations so that supervisors could say more specific things about how well the employee was meeting those expectations. Then really we asked people to just copy and paste in the objectives that they had for the first 6 months as a reminder of what that was, and then to fill out whether or not that objective was met and what the result might have been. We wanted people to feel reassured that nobody was going to get fired if their objectives weren't met. That there are lots of reasons that might not happen. It could be that we moved shelves around in a big project, or that you broke your leg, or that maybe you did some of something but then got pulled away to cover for an empty position, or there was another priority that we decided was more important than the thing that we set as an objective. That not meeting that objective is not failure. It may just mean that something came up, and that might mean that we move it to the next performance plan, or we just drop it altogether. But to kind of look at what happened with that objective and identify why it might not have been met was really kind of important. Then you turn around and look forward for the next 6 months. This is really familiar. It's essentially the same thing that's in that initial performance plan. And then a section for comments. Once we're kind of in the flow of this, you've got a plan, a period of time where you're getting coaching and feedback, and then you come to this review meeting where you see how you did, and then look forward to the next plan. It's a very cyclically, the cycle is really what we're focused on, that it isn't a thing that just happens at a specific time once a year, that it's an ongoing process. After working with this system for a while, we made some changes and added some features. One thing was to come up with a way to document the performance of employees who were transferring from one job to another or one location to another, to see how things went with the old set of objectives before moving on, and to give the new supervisor a way to orient the employee to their new job, to look at the expectations or duties and see if there's anything specific that they want the employee to focus on. Again, these aren't any official kind of performance review tools. It really was a way to keep the performance evaluation process at the top of our supervisors' minds. We really wanted them to be deliberate about talking about performance. So if this is going to be part of the process, we want to make sure it doesn't slide to the back of your calendar when you're in the midst of tying something up with an employee before they move to another job in the library system, or when you're trying to get them oriented in your department. We want performance to be part of that process, just intrinsically. So one of the major things that happened as a result of putting this process in place was that it helped us to make some big changes to the library's culture. As I said before, the culture wasn't exactly antagonistic, but there was a lot of trust and skepticism on the part of employees. We wanted employees to feel like we wanted to do right by them as the administration, that we needed their help to figure out how to walk the line between doing right by our staff and also doing right by our library customers. The work rules process put all of that out in the open. So getting that feedback from frontline staff who represented a wide array of our entire employee population really made a big difference. It gave people a real feeling of having a voice at that table, and it also raised issues that we might not have thought about otherwise. The Work Rules Committee also did a great job of communicating back to their coworkers about the process and how we were going about it, which was incredibly helpful. And I think that entire communication pathway really did a lot to help build trust in our organization and to make sure that staff felt like this was something that we authentically cared about, that we weren't just putting this in place because it was a thing that we had to do. We didn't want to make it just to jump through the hoops kind of a process or form, that we really cared about being able to improve individual and organizational performance. Just to back up a little bit, we also did a lot of training with supervisors. Many of our supervisors had never given any kind of performance review ever at all, much less had one themselves. So understanding how to give constructive feedback to staff was a very new set of skills for a lot of our supervisors. We actually did a retreat with our supervisors for a full day to talk a lot about expectations and how to give an evaluation. And we talked a lot about how to keep track of feedback. That, you know, the feedback that you give in passing when you see somebody doing something great is giving that feedback is terrifically important. But as important is making sure that you document that feedback somehow. It doesn't have to be anything official. We kind of put together this paper form that people could use. I had one supervisor who had an Excel spreadsheet with a tab for each employee where she would just jot down quickly, you know, I told this person they did this really well, or I reminded this person about this other thing again today. She password protected it and just would pull that up as part of her regular work routine. Having that feedback tracking and documentation makes it a lot easier to do the performance review because the information's all there. It just pulls that, you pull it out of the tracking mechanism and you're pretty much done. It also helps to keep the planning and review process separate from things that might become the basis for disciplinary action. So this can stand on its own separately from the review documentation. All in all, staff really reacted relatively well. There was a lot of anxiety about how this was going to go, but the feedback that we got was really good, that it wasn't scary, that it was kind of nice to have a chance to sit down and talk directly to the supervisor, to carve out that time and space that we really hadn't done before, and to really look forward. To not feel like we're always just reacting to things, but to do some actual planning. We got a lot of really positive feedback from staff who had been concerned or anxious at the beginning of the process. So that felt really good. I feel like we were on the right track there. So you may be thinking, okay, so this is all well and good. You got to start from scratch, which isn't something that anyone ever gets to do. So what am I supposed to do with this? Okay, so there are several options. One thing is that maybe you have some form that you have to use if you're a municipal library or if you're part of a larger organization like a university, and you don't have a lot of say in terms of what that form might look like. So maybe there's some wiggle room in that form. After all, the form shouldn't be the end-all be-all of any process. So talk to your HR folks and see what it is about the form that really is required. Is it just that you complete it? If that's the case, then maybe you can come up with a form that meets your needs better, and that if you give that to them, and that might do the trick to negotiate that as we did. Maybe there's a particular piece of data that they're trying to collect about how people are doing in their jobs, so maybe you can fill out just that part of their form and then supplement it with documentation of your own performance management process. There isn't anything that says that just because you have a cruddy form to deal with that you can't also do something that's more constructive or useful for you and your organization. Similarly, with job descriptions, you may have an official job description on the books that doesn't give you the kind of framework that you need to build this sort of performance management process. But that doesn't mean you can't create another document that would help inform the way you carry out performance management at your library. So maybe you take the dumb job description that we had and say, okay, so that's the official job description that they need in HR, but here within the library we're going to operate under this additional set of expectations. It isn't different. The job still is the job as it's described in the description, but we're going to have this set of expectations that we attach to that job, or that we're going to apply to a specific group of people doing that job because the tasks that they perform are a specific subset, and we're going to use that as something that we can hang the performance evaluation on top of. So there are some ways that you can kind of cobble together from what you may have to work with other pieces that help inform the kind of process that might be more useful to you at your organization. The other thing that you can do, regardless of the form or structure that you have in place, is to really focus on feedback. Everybody needs to understand that feedback is an incredibly valuable part of work, both supervisors and employees. Supervisors need special attention when it comes to how to give and document feedback, and then get in the habit of giving it and documenting. But everybody, the entire organization, needs to understand the importance of feedback and also how to be a good receiver of feedback. The Gallup organization has done a lot of research about employee engagement. They've identified these 12 factors that are great predictors of how well employees are engaged in their workplace. So workplaces that have more engaged employees are very directly linked to better success for that organization by whatever benchmark success is measured, whether that's profits or whatever outcome or output measures they might have. One of the big 12 is about how often you hear from someone about how you're doing at work. Not surprisingly, that feedback is critical for employee engagement. The saying is that people don't quit their job, they quit their boss, and feedback totally connects into that. If you don't hear from your boss about how you're doing, whether that's good or bad, that actively discourages engagement, as we saw from that study earlier on, and that's just a crying shame. Finally, I'd also urge you to focus on performance of the organization as a whole. So performance evaluation is an individual process, but the end result really needs to focus on improving the quality of service that your library provides. So even if you can't make any changes to your job description or to the form, One way to really help make your performance management process more relevant and more effective is to focus on the things that have the biggest impact on the way that you're providing service to your customers or patrons. Library staff tend to be hardworking and invested and passionate about the work that they do. I mean, we don't do it for the money. Even at the clerical or shelver level, I mean, you might make more money in retail or waiting tables, but so people who come to the library work here because they have an affinity for it. They care about what we do in the community or for our organization. So what are the things that really make an impact on providing great service? For me, as an administrator, this whole kind of process, developing this sort of performance management model, really makes an impact. It helps create a workplace that people feel invested in and engaged in, and it makes a big impact on the quality of service that we provide. So that impact really should drive the things that you're focusing on when it comes to evaluation. As I just said earlier, punctuality and attendance may or may not be important in every job, and it may or may not be important in the overall delivery of library service. That's something that you would need to determine for your own library. But focusing on the things that really do have an impact is going to make a big difference. That's the end of my formal presentation. I have a couple of different books that we looked at. If you want to read more about best practices in performance evaluation, along with my contact information, I'm pretty sure that we'll be able to make this presentation available, the slides for the presentation available after the webinar is over. But yeah, so otherwise, I'll turn it back over. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box, and I will be happy to answer them. I will say that the process that we have here at Naperville is not as far along the performance management kind of model continuum as what we were able to do at Brown County. And that has a lot to do with being able to start from scratch. Having a clean slate means you can build whatever you want. We have a process that's gone through lots of iterations over time, but without kind of clearing the slate and starting over. It makes it a little bit more difficult to make those changes, but it's something that as an administrative team we've talked about and are kind of moving forward with. One of the things that we've done is to simplify the form that we use for some of our more routine jobs, like our shelvers, our library monitors, things where it's kind of a yes or no. You're either doing the job or you're not doing the job, which has really helped things for supervisors. It's made that process a lot less kind of artificial and arbitrary. Any chat questions? One question, so how do you determine individual salary increases? At Brown County, in some ways, we had the benefit of not having to answer that question because there had not been salary increases for a couple of years, which is not exactly a good thing, but it kind of gave us some time and we dodged the bullet a little bit on that. As I was leaving Brown County, we were going through the process of doing a new factoring of our jobs and looking at comparables and making sure that we came up with salary ranges. We had, under contract, had a situation where everyone in a particular job category made exactly the same amount of money regardless of how long they've worked at the library. So someone new came in at the same pay rate as someone who'd been there for 25 years, which is also crazy. So we started to talk about what does it mean when that happens? How does that reward kind of commitment and longevity? How does it reward performance? And we talked about how to do merit-based raises. At the time that I was leaving, the library board was looking at how to roll those out. And what they ended up doing was putting together a committee of supervisors as well as the library director to really make those decisions on an across-the-board basis. There were kind of 3 levels that you would either get a pay raise of like 1% as a cost of living. People who were doing their jobs consistently well got another rate of pay, and I'm not sure what the exact percentage was. And then there were a handful of people who kind of fell into the star performer category. Those were decided as a group, so it wasn't just one person. And it wasn't different people looking at different staff so we used recommendations from supervisors, but that process was really completely separate from the performance evaluation process. So raises had not been based on merit previously. It was strictly cost of living, and that was bargained as part of the union contracts. So this was a big change for them to go through, and I think that they are still working out the kinks. One of the questions, what do you think is the optimal number of direct reports to any given supervisor? That's a really good question. And I think it depends on the kind of work that the supervisor is kind of keeping track of. For some jobs, again, where it's a yes or no, you're doing the job or you're not doing the job, I think it's easier to take on more staff members. The less concrete the tasks are, the fewer staff I think you can really handle well, unless that's the only thing that you're doing. At Brown County, I had 4 direct reports. Here at Naperville, I have 6. I feel like 6 is a really awesome number. As everyone who I supervise is on our executive team or as a supervisor themselves. But that's a tough question to ask. Yeah. There are some studies out there about 7 plus or minus 2, like that's a really good number for a team or for supervision, but I don't know that there's an exact arbitrary number that you can just kind of slap on it. It also depends on the supervisor and how skilled or willing they are to take on more. One of the questions, how long did it take to develop your process? Did you roll it out in stages? We absolutely rolled it out in stages. We created that initial performance plan form before we had a performance review form in place. We just kind of jumped out on faith, figuring that by the time we got to the 6-month mark, we would have had enough time to put that form together. So it ended up actually working out really well. The other thing that we did that ended up inadvertently working out really well was rolling out that performance review for new staff, that initial performance review as we finished each job description. So some people's were ready to go like 8 months before we finally finished the last of the job descriptions. It ended up kind of phasing things in and allowing us to look at the process and see what was working and what wasn't. There's the question, do you use different forms for different departments? We don't. And that was one of the things that I have to say I really love about the process we came up with, because it's so closely tied to the job description. The form really references that job description. So whatever the job description is that you're working under, you're going to have a separate set of duties and expectations that you're going to be looking at when you address those particular items for each person. It makes it a really nice universal form, because it isn't the form that determines what you're looking at, it's the description itself. And then the last question, did you encounter people who were resistant to change the new forms, shift in job responsibilities, and did you feel your forms worked well for that? Absolutely, there were people who were resistant to change. Absolutely. That whole work rules process was just one big, huge, long lesson in change management and how to best communicate change and reassure people through a big change process. I would say that for the most part, because we did so much kind of communication and discussion, people weren't outright just, I'm planting my feet and no way am I going to do this, resistant to change. There were definitely people, supervisors in particular, who were uncomfortable with having to give feedback to individuals, and were also uncomfortable with the question of fair versus equal, that you can have two staff in the same job and their performance evaluations can cover really different things depending on who those people are, but that you can still look at those and say, yes, these people are both meeting expectations. That level of kind of gray area made some of our supervisors really very uncomfortable, and I would say they're still probably grappling with that. The other thing that I think came as a shock to our supervisors was the amount of time that it takes to really do supervision well. One thing that they heard me say over and over again is that the most important part of your job as a supervisor is paying attention to your staff. And it's hard to do when you're short-staffed to begin with and you're putting out fires and you're reacting to the stuff that comes up and trying to do that on-the-spot problem solving. So shifting habits, I think, was a tough row to hoe for some of our staff, that they really didn't realize how much time it took to do it well. And it does. It takes a lot of time and effort to really pay attention to performance and document and be able to give that feedback in an effective way. But again, that investment of time pays off in having less fires to put out and fewer things to react to. It makes my job easier as a supervisor if I invest that time in you as an employee, because you're more effective in doing your job. So I think that focusing on that improvement and on ongoing feedback really did help people to make that adjustment, and the fact that it went both ways, that supervisors got feedback from staff as well, not in any formal way, but to know that the supervisors would be going through the exact same process as employees really made a big difference. I think that's it for questions. Joe, I apologize for you too that your microphone isn't working. I'm sorry I didn't get to hear you give your sign off, but I'm happy to step in and do the question and answer piece. And thank you to everybody for participating. Performance evaluation and performance management is one of those ongoing things that, because it takes time and because it's hard, we can never get enough practice doing it or enough conversation about how to do it well. So I appreciate your attention, and thanks again for letting me present.